Welcome, fellow seekers of lost history. Before we descend into the mist-veiled shores of early medieval Scandinavia, take a moment to share where in the world you're joining from, and what hour finds you here tonight. Whether you're wrapped in blankets in New York, watching the first light over Tokyo, or drifting between sleep and wakefulness somewhere in between, I'm honored you've chosen to walk this shadowed path with me. If these deep dives into humanity's darkest chapters resonate with you, consider subscribing so you never miss a step on our journey into the past. Now, let today's noise fade. Let electric light and city sound dissolve. Imagine a world where survival was uncertain and fate arrived on creaking wood and the rhythm of oars. Picture the North Sea cloaked in fog. The year 793, the water lies still, disturbed only by the silent dip of paddles breaking through the cold surface. But this is no quiet fishing boat. These are longships, sleek, narrow, and fast gliding toward an unaware coast. Their figureheads, carved like dragons or beasts, cut through the mist like omens of something terrible. Onboard men sit in silence. Warriors hardened by winters and warfare prepare for what's to come. They check their armor, sharpen their blades, and fix their gaze toward a shoreline where villagers have just begun their morning prayers. These are the Vikings, word that, even after centuries, still echoes with unease. Popular culture has softened their image stories of adventurous seafarers, curious explorers, even misunderstood heroes. But the reality was far more harrowing than any romantic tale can capture. Viking raids were not tales of swashbuckling bravery. They were precise and fearsome, coordinated storm of violence that reshaped the map of Europe and scarred the hearts of entire generations. For nearly 300 years, from the late 700s to the early 1000s, longships emerged from the cold fjords of the north like phantoms. They struck quickly, vanished just as fast, and left behind ashes, ruin, and silence. They burned monasteries, emptied villages. People fled inland, abandoning lands that had belonged to their ancestors for centuries. But what pushed these seafarers, once farmers and tradesmen, to become some of the most feared invaders of the medieval age? What shifted them from homesteaders to warriors whose very name could spark panic? Tonight we peel back the veil. We'll look past the myths and explore what truly lay beneath. We'll stand with the monks watching unfamiliar sails appear on the horizon. We'll witness what happens when communities accustomed to peace face an enemy that offers no mercy. And we'll try to understand what happens to people, ordinary people, when they are shaped by a world where power was taken, not given. This isn't just about swords or ships. It's about a collision of worlds. It's about how brutality can become methodical, even efficient, and how entire societies reshape themselves to survive an era of dread. As we walk through this chapter soaked in fear and fire, remember that behind every burned building, every shattered relic, there were people, families, lives interrupted without warning. The Vikings left behind sagas and ships, yes, but their victims left behind only whispers. Their stories are carved not in stone, but in the quiet of absence. In places where once there was laughter, and now only ruins remain. So settle in. Your modern world slip away. Tonight, we return to a time when honor and terror lived side by side, where the difference between protector and predator was razor thin, and where the echoes of those ancient cries still seem to drift across northern winds. Because in confronting this darkness, we come closer to understanding something deeper, something about ourselves, something ancient, something that even now waits quietly beneath the surface of our modern peace. Let's continue. True horror of Viking raids didn't lie in their arrival. It came in what followed after those sleek ships scraped against foreign shores. Picture it. You're a monk at Lindisfarne, bent over your work at dawn. The sea outside is shrouded in mist, thick like a burial shroud. Somewhere beyond it, silent oars pulled death steadily toward you.
Outward!
These weren't aimless brutes. Despite the stories, Viking attacks weren't wild flurries of rage. They were precise, coldly organized, strategic. What made them terrifying was the efficiency behind the chaos. When their ships hit sand, what followed wasn't disordered. It was a choreographed storm. Raiders moved like a unit, each man knowing his role. Some would hold the boats and secure escape. Others would surround the target site, sealing off every exit. Then came the most feared among them, those who specialized in close quarters terror. The berserkers were real, but not the frothing, out-of-control savages of legend. These were elite fighters. Men trained or perhaps conditioned to reach a state beyond pain or fear. Some historians suggest they may have used natural stimulants to trigger their trance-like rage. Others believe it was the brutal rhythm of battle itself that transformed them. Whatever the cause, when these warriors entered their frenzy, they became nearly unstoppable, immune to pain, disconnected from hesitation, focused only on destruction. But perhaps even more unsettling were the others, the ones who weren't. Berserkers, everyday raiders, fishermen, farmers, men who, back home, tended animals and crops. Yet once aboard a ship, they became something else entirely. Welcome, fellow seekers of lost history. Before we descend into the mist-veiled shores of early medieval Scandinavia, take a moment to share where in the world you're joining from, and what hour finds you here tonight. Whether you're wrapped in blankets in New York, watching the first light over Tokyo, or drifting between sleep and wakefulness somewhere in between, I'm honored you've chosen to walk this shadowed path with me. If these deep dives into humanity's darkest chapters resonate with you, consider subscribing so you never miss a step on our journey into the past. Now, let today's noise fade. Let electric light and city sound dissolve. Imagine a world where survival was uncertain and fate arrived on creaking wood and the rhythm of oars. Picture the North Sea cloaked in fog. The year 793, the water lies still, disturbed only by the silent dip of paddles breaking through the cold surface. But this is no quiet fishing boat. These are longships, sleek, narrow, and fast gliding toward an unaware coast. Their figureheads, carved like dragons or beasts, cut through the mist like omens of something terrible. On-board men sit in silence. Warriors, hardened by winters and warfare, prepare for what's to come. They check their armor, sharpen their blades, and fix their gaze toward a shoreline where villagers have just begun their morning prayers. These are the Vikings, a word that, even after centuries, still echoes with unease. Popular culture has softened their image stories of adventurous seafarers, curious explorers, even misunderstood heroes. But the reality was far more harrowing than any romantic tale can capture. Viking raids were not tales of swashbuckling bravery. They were precise and fearsome, a coordinated storm of violence that reshaped the map of Europe and scarred the hearts of entire generations. For nearly 300 years, from the late 700s to the early 1000s, longships emerged from the cold fjords of the north like phantoms. They struck quickly, vanished just as fast, and left behind ashes, ruin, and silence. They burned monasteries, emptied villages. People fled inland, abandoning lands that had belonged to their ancestors for centuries. But what pushed these seafarers, once farmers and tradesmen, to become some of the most feared invaders of the medieval age? What shifted them from homesteaders to warriors whose very name could spark panic? Tonight we peel back the veil. We'll look past the myths and explore what truly lay beneath. We'll stand with the monks watching unfamiliar sails appear on the horizon. We'll witness what happens when communities accustomed to peace face an enemy that offers no mercy. And we'll try to understand what happens to people, ordinary people, when they are shaped by a world where power was taken, not given. This isn't just about swords or ships. It's about a collision of worlds. It's about how brutality can become methodical, even efficient, and how entire societies reshape themselves to survive an era of dread. As we walk through this chapter soaked in fear and fire, remember that behind every burned building, every shattered relic, there were people, families, lives interrupted without warning. The Vikings left behind sagas and ships, yes, but their victims left behind only whispers. Their stories are carved not in stone, but in the quiet of absence. In places where once there was laughter, and now only ruins remain. So settle in. Your modern world slip away. Tonight, we return to a time when honor and terror lived side by side. where the difference between protector and predator was razor thin, and where the echoes of those ancient cries still seem to drift across northern winds. Because in confronting this darkness, we come closer to understanding something deeper, something about ourselves, something ancient, something that even now waits quietly beneath the surface of our modern peace. Let's continue. True horror of Viking raids didn't lie in their arrival. It came in what followed after those sleek ships scraped against foreign shores. Picture it. You're a monk at Lindisfarne, bent over your work at dawn. The sea outside is shrouded in mist, thick like a burial shroud. Somewhere beyond it, silent oars pulled death steadily toward you.
Outward!
These weren't aimless brutes. Despite the stories, Viking attacks weren't wild flurries of rage. They were precise, coldly organized, strategic. What made them terrifying was the efficiency behind the chaos. When their ships hit sand, what followed wasn't disordered. It was a choreographed storm. Raiders moved like a unit, each man knowing his role. Some would hold the boats and secure escape. Others would surround the target site, sealing off every exit. Then came the most feared among them, those who specialized in close quarters terror. The berserkers were real, but not the frothing, out-of-control savages of legend. These were elite fighters. Men trained or perhaps conditioned to reach a state beyond pain or fear. Some historians suggest they may have used natural stimulants to trigger their trance-like rage. Others believe it was the brutal rhythm of battle itself that transformed them. Whatever the cause, when these warriors entered their frenzy, they became nearly unstoppable, immune to pain, disconnected from hesitation, focused only on destruction. But perhaps even more unsettling were the others, the ones who weren't. Berserkers, everyday raiders, fishermen, farmers, men who, back home, tended animals and crops. Yet once aboard a ship, they became something else entirely. The destruction didn't stop with stolen treasure. The Vikings also dismantled the very foundations of survival. They burned mills that ground grain, demolished fishing boats vital to coastal economies, and slaughtered livestock animals that represented generations of breeding and stability. Each act was chosen with precision, not as random destruction, but as a long-term blow to recovery. One of the most disturbing and central aspects of Viking economic power was the slave trade. Human trafficking wasn't just an afterthought. It was a primary motive. The markets of the Islamic world had a growing demand for European slaves, and Viking raiders became key suppliers. A single raid could yield hundreds of captives, each a commodity in the bustling slave markets of Constantinople, Baghdad, or Cordoba. The way this was carried out added another dimension of terror. Viking slavers intentionally broke family bonds to increase control. Children were separated from their mothers. Spouses were torn apart. Siblings placed on different ships. It wasn't senseless cruelty. It was deliberate, emotional trauma. Weakened resistance and made captives more compliant. Women and children, heartbreakingly, were especially sought after. In foreign markets, they commanded higher prices. Young women were often forced into lives of domestic servitude, while children were raised in captivity. Shaped from a young age into roles that erased their former identities. The fear that a child might vanish into this system haunted every parent in a raiding zone. This network of forced migration reached staggering proportions. Archaeological discoveries and surviving records confirm that Viking slavers operated across enormous distances, from the Arctic Circle to the Mediterranean, from Ireland to the borders of the Byzantine Empire. Markets were established in cities like Dublin, York, and Kyiv, connecting multiple regions into an international trade of human lives. Though exact numbers are difficult to confirm, conservative estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of people were enslaved during the Viking Age. This not only left scars on individuals and families, but altered the demographic and cultural landscape of entire regions in medieval Europe. But the damage wasn't just economic or demographic hit. It was deeply cultural and spiritual. Viking raiders struck at the heart of Christian identity. They didn't only target wealth, they targeted meaning. Churches and monasteries were more than buildings. They were places of guidance, sanctuary, and community identity. When Vikings set fire to these sites, it wasn't just plundered, It was an assault on the soul. It was about sending a message that even the most sacred spaces weren't safe. These desecrations were chillingly specific. Altars were defiled, sacred art destroyed, manuscripts burned. Some churches were even repurposed as shelters for the raiders' horses or turned into temporary camps. These weren't reckless acts, they were tactical, psychological attacks, designed to shake faith and shatter morale. When these libraries and holy places went up in flames, the loss wasn't just to the present, it was to future generations. Much of what we know about ancient philosophy, science, and early Christian thought survived only because monks painstakingly copied texts. When those monasteries burned, centuries of accumulated wisdom vanished in moments. The psychological weight of this cultural destruction rippled far beyond the affected towns. News of ruined churches and looted abbeys traveled quickly across Christendom. For many medieval Christians, it felt like more than war, it felt apocalyptic. Chroniclers at the time often interpreted these attacks as signs of divine punishment. The idea that such destruction could only be explained as a form of heavenly wrath gained traction, prompting a wave of religious reflection and fear. This spiritual anxiety reshaped society. Fasting, penance, and prayer became more urgent. Communities began to see themselves as part of a broader Christian world, united not just by faith, but by shared vulnerability. This shift helped foster early forms of Christian unity across regions that had once been isolated. On a broader scale, Viking raids forced a complete restructuring of society. Prosperity was replaced by survival. Communities organized around defense instead of trade or growth. This change wasn't temporary, it created long-term consequences that extended far beyond the Viking era. Traditional social orders were appended. The ability to wield a sword suddenly mattered more than noble lineage or religious standing. Those who could defend their people gained status, while those who could not saw their influence diminish. This shift in values laid the groundwork for the feudal structures that would dominate Europe for centuries. The economic transformation was just as severe. Agriculture and trade took a backseat to building fortifications and raising militias. Fields that once grew crops were abandoned in favor of defensible hills. Merchants became reluctant warriors. The effects of this shift: poverty, famine, stagnation lingered for generations. The human cost went far beyond death and displacement. The very fabric of family life unraveled. Young men, often gone for long stretches, either as defenders or counter-raiders, left behind disrupted households. Marriages were delayed. Families shrank. The loss of life and enslavement left gender imbalances in many regions. With long-term effects on demographics and kinship structures, women carried a disproportionate share of the burden. Beyond the physical dangers they faced during raids, they had to lead households and sustain communities. Alone, many took on roles previously reserved for men: managing lands, defending homes, organizing daily life. In doing so, the rigid gender structures of medieval society began to shift, slowly and unevenly, in ways that would echo into the future. Children, perhaps most tragically, bore the invisible wounds. Many grew up surrounded by trauma. They watched villages burn, saw loved ones taken. They internalized these horrors, forming a generation shaped by fear. These children grew cautious, mistrustful, and hardened. Their education was often cut short as schools and monasteries. Primary centers of learning were destroyed or abandoned. Literacy rates plummeted. Whole regions lost access to books and instruction. The cultural development of Europe was delayed in some areas by generations. The ripple effects of that setback are still measured by historians today. Exposure to violence didn't just traumatize it, normalized. For many children, strength was survival, and cruelty was expected. The idea that the powerful could dominate the weak became woven into the cultural DNA. These lessons shaped how those children lived, how they ruled, and how they raised their own children. This societal transformation gave rise to new institutions: feudalism, knightly orders, military aristocracy, all products of a world shaped by repeated cycles of fear and loss. The Vikings hadn't just destroyed, they had remade, and yet, To truly grasp the scale of this legacy, we must look closer not at numbers, but at lives take. For example, a young Irish monk named Brendan. In 824 CE, his monastery was attacked. Brendan had dedicated his life to copying sacred texts, pouring years of work into a gospel manuscript illuminated with gold and lapis. When the Vikings came, he watched that manuscript and everything it represented reduced to ash. His abbot was killed. His fellow monks were taken. Brendan was left behind, wounded, his faith shaken. He survived, but he never copied again. His hands healed, but something deeper did not. Or Astrid, a Saxon woman whose village was attacked in 867 CE. Her husband and eldest son were killed before her eyes. Her 2 younger children taken. She was held captive for months, then escaped during a winter storm. She returned home only to find her village gone, silent, erased. She spent the rest of her life searching for her children, following rumors, scanning faces in crowds. She never found them. These stories are not exceptions. They are the threads from which this history is woven. Every destroyed monastery was once a sanctuary of knowledge. Every slave ship carried people with names, dreams, families erased. Many survivors lived with what we now recognize as trauma. Chroniclers describe people who flinched at shadows, who refused to sleep indoors, who clutched children tighter. With each gust of wind, some became vigilantes, devoting their lives to revenge. Others withdrew from the world entirely, seeking peace and solitude. The effects spread beyond individuals. When a village lost its protector, order collapsed. A family lost its provider. Poverty followed. When a region lost too many, it emptied out, leaving behind fields to rot and buildings to crumble. The resilience required to rebuild from such devastation was unimaginable. And yet, rebuild they did. That Europe survived, that it flourished, in time is a testament to human endurance. But it came at enormous cost. Scars lingered for centuries, some visible, others buried in memory and tradition. The Vikings themselves present a paradox that resists simple judgment. They were not demons or simple destroyers. They were complex. Their brutality was matched by brilliance. The same people who led raids across Europe were also master craftsmen, poets, and explorers. Artifacts recovered from Viking homelands reveal astonishing skill jewelry with intricate detail. Tools engineered with care, weapons, both beautiful and deadly. Their ships were marvels of design, allowing them to travel farther and faster than anyone else of their time. They also had a culture rich in myth and poetry. Their sagas remain among the most powerful literature from the medieval world, filled with drama, wisdom, and insight. Even gender roles in Viking society were, in some ways. Some chroniclers noted that Viking raiders didn't just carry out violence, they seemed to enjoy it. Accounts describe men laughing during attacks, boasting about who caused the most fear or damage. It wasn't just about treasure or religious duty. For many, the chaos itself was a source of pride and fulfillment. This doesn't necessarily mean they were cruel by nature in the modern sense. Instead, it reflects a cultural framework where success in warfare was the highest measure of personal value. A warrior who returned from a raid with spoils and captives wasn't shunned, he was honored. Songs were composed in his name. His deeds were told and retold, ensuring he lived on in legend. This created powerful motivation. Young men were encouraged to seek glory through conflict. Victory meant status, admiration, and access to wealth. But one of the most unsettling aspects of Viking culture wasn't what happened on the battlefield. It was what happened afterward. The same individuals who had spent weeks or months attacking foreign towns would return home and slip seamlessly back into peaceful domestic life. They resumed roles as husbands, farmers, craftsmen, and community leaders. They celebrated family festivals, worshipped their gods, and tended their fields. This contrast reveals something deeply complex. These weren't people detached from humanity. They hadn't lost their minds to violence. Instead, they lived by a moral code that shifted depending on context. What was forbidden at home was permitted and, even celebrated abroad. Violence wasn't random. It was situational, directed only at those outside their community. That Viking society not only accepted but admired this duality speaks volumes. About its values, children grew up hearing stories of raids as heroic adventures. Young women sought partners who had proven themselves in combat. Older men passed down tales of past campaigns as life lessons, complete with advice on tactics and survival. This normalization of violence made Viking society formidable, but also unstable. While they were powerful against outsiders, the same aggressive tendencies often turned inward. Internal conflicts, feuds, and rivalries became common. Eventually, this contributed to the decline of Viking dominance. The legacy of these raids, however, did not vanish with their decline. The ripple effects reshaped European civilization in ways both visible and invisible. From governance to religion, the memory of these campaigns left a deep imprint. Politically, the Viking threat forced European kingdoms to adapt or collapse. As centralized authorities struggled to provide defense, local leaders stepped into the gap. This shift helped give rise to the feudal system, a decentralized network where landowners protected people in exchange for loyalty and service. This structure defined European society for centuries. The militarization that began in response to Viking attacks didn't end when the raids stopped. A culture of warfare took root. Ability became synonymous with military leadership. Orders of knights emerged. Honor became linked to battlefield success. This ethos echoed throughout medieval Europe, shaping not just politics but philosophy and law. The economic damage was equally deep. Monasteries and trade hubs were destroyed, severing connections that had taken generations to build. Travel became dangerous. Trade routes were disrupted. Regional economies shrank and became more isolated, reinforcing the fragmentation of the early medieval period. Meanwhile, the wealth extracted by Viking raiders was not lost. It was redirected, flowed back into Scandinavian society, redistributed through trade, alliances, and domestic development. This shifted the economic balance across Europe and altered the trajectories of many communities. Culturally and spiritually, the impact was devastating. Sacred texts, irreplaceable artifacts, and ancient writings were destroyed. Entire branches of classical knowledge, surviving remnants of the Roman world, were lost forever in fires and looted libraries. The gap these losses created can still be felt in the historical record today. The trauma of these raids also transformed how Europeans understood violence. What had once been unthinkable became commonplace. The constant exposure to brutality helped foster a warrior ethos that glorified conquest. Feeding into future military campaigns, including the Crusades, religious attitudes shifted too. Many interpreted the suffering caused by Viking raids as divine punishment. This belief sparked increased devotion and new forms of militant faith. The idea that war could be waged in the name of righteousness, that violence could serve a holy cause, took root in this crucible of fear and hope. That same belief system would later fuel large-scale religious conflicts, where acts of war were framed as sacred duties. The seeds of that mindset were planted, in part by the spiritual response to the Viking threat. Demographically, the losses were staggering. Tens of thousands of people were taken or killed in many areas. Entire populations disappeared, farmland was abandoned, villages emptied. Skilled labor builders, teachers, clergy was lost, leaving communities hollowed out and vulnerable. Generational knowledge was disrupted, traditions faded. Children grew up without mentors, without books, without peace. Fear became a constant companion. In many regions, that fear became culture baked into language, custom, and belief. The psychological toll didn't end with those directly affected. Trauma passed down. Parents raised children with warnings instead of lullabies. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion. Peace, when it came, was never trusted. In the stories passed down through folklore and song, the Viking became more than a raider. He became a symbol of chaos, a memory of terror that shaped how Europe viewed its northern neighbors for centuries. Yet the Viking legacy is not solely one of destruction. There were unintended benefits to the challenges they posed. In being forced to defend themselves, European societies became more adaptable. Castles were improved, strategies evolved, technologies were adopted and refined. The need to resist such a mobile and intelligent foe accelerated innovation, and despite the violent context, exposure to Viking culture brought new ideas. Scandinavian craftsmanship, shipbuilding techniques, and even art styles filtered into the wider European world. In some cases, relationships were forged not just through conquest, but through trade and settlement. The end of the Viking Age didn't come through decisive battle. It came gradually, through change. As Norse societies embraced Christianity and moved toward centralized governance, the appeal of raiding declined. Younger generations were raised with different values. The energy once spent on conquest was redirected toward building, but while the raids stopped, the patterns they introduced didn't vanish. Many of the tactics honed during Viking campaigns, economic targeting, psychological pressure, cultural destruction, would later be adopted by European powers during their own expansions. In that sense, the Viking Age foreshadowed the imperial eras to come. Seen in this light, Viking raids were not an isolated phenomenon, but a prototype. A first chapter in the longer story of European aggression, colonization, and military expansion. And yet, the most powerful lesson of the Viking Age is not about violence, but about human nature. These were not monsters or creatures of myth. They were human beings. They made choices. Their societies provided the structures that encouraged those choices. The fact that ordinary people capable of poetry, community, and craftsmanship could also commit such acts of harm is what makes this history so haunting. It's also what makes it so relevant. Understanding how violence can be normalized, how cruelty can be celebrated under certain systems, helps us see the warning signs in our own time. It also helps us remember that what seems unthinkable can quickly become common if the culture allows it. And yet among the ruins, there is another thread. Survival. Communities rebuilt. Families found ways to continue. Wisdom and hope endured through song, story, and stubborn memory. The resilience required to live through that era, to face loss, fear, and grief, and still believe in rebuilding is nothing short of extraordinary. The fact that medieval civilizations survived the Viking Age and even thrived in the centuries after is a testament to the strength of the human spirit. The legacy of the Viking raids is a complicated one. It reminds us how easily violence can spread when rewarded, and how hard it is to break cycles of conflict once they begin. But it also shows that healing is possible, that from ruin, renewal can rise. As we reflect on this history, we are not simply looking into the past, we are looking into ourselves. These were not alien people in a distant world. They were us. Their struggles, choices, and consequences still echo in the systems and values we live with today. The Viking story is both a warning and a mirror. A reminder that civilization is fragile, that culture can turn in dark directions, but also that communities can endure, grow wiser, and carry forward the lessons carved from fire and ashdod. And so, as the sun rose across frost-covered fields and church bells echoed through the mist, medieval villages stirred once more. The day began not with war, but with hope, a quiet defiance against the shadows that had once darkened their skies. But for most inhabitants of medieval Scotland, daily life allowed little time for reflection or rest. Survival occupied every waking moment. In the modest stone huts scattered across the highlands and lowlands, families gathered around the last glowing embers of peat fires, coaxing warmth from scraps of fuel. Children, wrapped in threadbare wool, shivered as mothers prepared thin porridge from whatever grain they could spare. These were the overlooked majority, the foundation of Scottish society, whose lives were rarely recorded in history books. The feudal system that structured medieval Scotland was a rigid hierarchy, with peasants forming its wide and weary base. Bound by law and tradition, they owed not only their labor, but their very existence to the landowners who ruled over them. Movement was restricted. Marriage required permission. even in death. A portion of their possessions was claimed by their lord. Consider the imagined life of Duncan MacLeod, a fictional but representative figure from the Highlands. Born into servitude beneath the shadow of a crumbling keep, Duncan's path was set before he could speak. His father had been a bondsman before him, and his grandfather before that, each generation tied to the same land, the same fate. By 5, Duncan gathered kindling and kept watch over younger siblings while his parents worked the fields. By 10, he trailed behind his father, learning to guide oxen through stubborn soil that yielded barely enough grain to last the winter. His hands grew rough and blistered. His back bent with the weight of ceaseless toil. Seasons dictated the rhythm of life. Spring meant plowing and sowing, racing the weather. Summer brought weeding and worry, praying that neither flood nor drought would destroy their labor. Autumn was harvest season, when the entire village worked from dawn until darkness to gather enough grain before winter's grip returned. Even in good years, the family kept only a portion of what they grew. The local lord demanded his share, the church required its tithe, and the rest had to last through months of frost and scarcity. Too often it didn't. Duncan learned early the ache of hunger, the weakness it brought, the way it silenced children's laughter. He watched younger siblings grow pale and thin during harsh winters, their small frames unable to endure a diet of watery broth and stale bread. Illness was a constant threat. In tight quarters shared with animals and lacking clean water or medical understanding, disease spread easily. At 15, Duncan lost his mother to a fever that her exhausted body could no longer resist. Malnutrition and overwork had left her vulnerable like so many others. Social isolation was another burden. Leaving the Lord's land required permission, which was seldom granted. Duncan's world was limited to a handful of faces and fields. Year after year, education was discouraged. Literacy might encourage questions about fairness, freedom, or faith, and yet, within these limits, the human spirit endured. Duncan found moments of escape, the stillness of winter evenings. He carved small figures from wood-simple creations that brought a flicker of beauty into their lives. The village youth invented games to test strength and skill, carving joy from monotony. Around hearths, elders told stories of ancient heroes and enchanted forest stales handed down through generations, keeping memory and imagination alive. These oral traditions gave shape to hope. They reminded people they were more than laborers. They were part of something older and deeper. Faith, too, offered both comfort and obligation. The church required regular attendance and took its tenth of whatever little people had, but it also provided a framework for understanding suffering. Life was hard, yes, but perhaps it was a test, a passage towards something better. Duncan married young, as most peasants did. His bride was from a nearby farm. Their union was practical, a pooling of effort and resources rather than romance. But over time, affection bloomed. They found companionship in the shared struggle, a quiet bond that deepened with each passing season. Children came quickly. With no medical care and only the help of older village women, births were dangerous. Many infants died within their first year. Those who survived began working, young hauling water, tending animals, assisting in fields. The cycle repeated itself. Childhood shortened, labor unending. As Duncan aged, the toll of decades of work showed. His joints stiffened, his back remained hunched, and his hands curled from arthritis. There was no retirement, no rest, only the gradual slowing of a body too burdened to continue. When he could no longer work, he became yet another mouth to feed in a family already stretched to the limit. Political unrest brought additional hardship. When noble factions clashed over land or influence, it was peasant homes that burned, peasant crops that were trampled, peasant sons who were conscripted into wars that had nothing to do with them. Duncan lived through several of these upheavals. Watching his fields ruined by marching soldiers and his neighbors taken for battles they did not understand. The wars for Scottish independence, those that produced legends like Wallace and Bruce, were felt very differently by people like Duncan. For nobles, these were moments of destiny. For peasants, they meant soldiers raiding barns and livestock vanishing overnight. Even a successful campaign could leave a village hungry and broken. Peace offered little respite. Dangers remained: thieves, harsh tax collectors, forced labor. For castle repairs or road building, justice was meted out by the same elites who profited from the people's suffering, though fictional. Duncan's story echoes the real lives of countless medieval Scotsmen and women whose names vanished. With time, they were the invisible builders of their nation. Their labor funded monuments, manors, and armies. They slept under leaking roofs, yet their toil supported crowns. But their efforts were not meaningless. Over generations, the feudal system began to shift. The slow realization of human worth and dignity, the birth of democratic principles, all had roots in the resilience of people like Duncan. Their quiet persistence under impossible odds kept human values alive when everything else conspired to erase them. The harshness of their lives helped shape the Scottish identity: endurance, loyalty, skepticism of authority, and the ability to find joy in small things. These qualities grew from centuries of hardship. In time, these very traits would contribute to Scotland's powerful voice in philosophy, literature, and politics. Reflecting on their lives forces us to confront a vital truth. This suffering wasn't inevitable. It was created by systems built to benefit the few at the expense of the many. Understanding that history helps us recognize its echoes in our own time, and to protect the rights and freedoms that were bought with such pain. The peasants of medieval Scotland lived and died in anonymity. Their names are lost, their graves are unmarked. But their legacy endures in the principles they preserved, the stories they passed down, and the simple, enduring truth that even in the darkest conditions, human dignity survives. They remind us that worth is not measured in wealth or titles. It is found in endurance, in kindness, in shared struggle. What is most remarkable is not how they suffered, but how they survived against a world that gave them little. They gave each other everything: love, laughter, courage. They passed down not just burdens, but strength. Not just hardship, but hope. Their story is not one of defeat, but of quiet, enduring victory. And though we cannot change their fate, we can honor their memory by continuing the work they began, striving for a world where no one's worth is measured by their poverty, where dignity is never denied by circumstance. The Viking invasions left deep scars on Europe, but in their aftermath, another kind of struggle unfolded. In the villages and crofts of medieval Scotland, ordinary people waged a different battle against hunger, cold, and the weight of social control. The longships had returned to northern shores, but the legacy of conquest remained. The new rulers carved up the land, replacing the shock of sudden raids with the slow pressure of forced labor. The same fields scorched by Viking fires now belonged to distant lords who knew little of the lives they controlled. The tools of domination had simply changed from axe to law, from torch to tax. And yet, in stone cottages lit by firelight and warmed by shared stories, the people endured, and in that endurance lies the true legacy of medieval Scotland, not in the castles or crowns, but in the strength of those who are never meant to be remembered, but whose spirit lives on, all the same. In medieval Scotland, the daily life of peasants was defined not by devotion or ritual, but by relentless labor. Each morning began before dawn to the tolling of church bells echoing across the glens. These bells, unlike the monastic ones, silenced by Viking raids generations earlier, did not summon spiritual reflection, but demanded yet another day of servitude. Peasants rose from straw-filled beds, their bodies stiff from cold and hunger. Many remembered the old stories, how their grandparents had hidden in root cellars to escape Viking raiders. Now, they found themselves bound to the very land once defended, unable to leave without permission or marry without consent. Even grain had to be milled at the Lord's designated mill, with a fee enriching those in power. In the fields where Viking bonfires once lit the night, peasants now labored with primitive wooden plows and half-starved oxen. Men trudged through rocky soil, their hands blackened and faces aged by weather. Women toiled just as fiercely, milking livestock, hauling water, spinning wool. Their labor never ceased, and the children joined young. Boys chased off crows in fields. Girls tended gardens and helped their mothers. Food was scarce and repetitive, mostly a thin gruel of oats or barley, rarely supplemented with meat. Their homes, crude hovels often shared with animals, had dirt floors, poor ventilation, and smoke-filled air. Illness thrived in such environments. Diseases like dysentery and tuberculosis swept through communities. When the Black Death arrived, it devastated a population already weakened by hunger and harsh living conditions. Institutions that had once protected the poor during Norse invasions became new sources of suffering. The church demanded tithes from families who could barely eat. Monasteries, once known for charity, now charged for help. Nobles, claiming descent from warriors who once repelled the Vikings, exploited those beneath them with ruthless efficiency. Legal structure reinforced this inequality. Peasants had no freedom of movement, no rights in marriage or death, and no appeal for justice. It was a system more enduring and oppressive than Viking conquest, an economy of extraction sustained by unbreakable customs, yet the human spirit endured. Songs whispered to children, stories told beside peat fires, and small acts of kindness between neighbors carried forward a resilient cultural identity. This quiet defiance, passed through generations, would one day fuel the fires of reform. Among the most reviled workers were the cesspit cleaners, the laborers, whose jobs took them into the most degrading corners of society. Consider Duncan MacLeod, fictional but representative, who served at Stirling Castle around 1340 each morning. Duncan descended into the castle's filth-laden depths armed with only a bucket and ladle. The work was dangerous. Slick stone steps, toxic gases, and the ever-present risk of collapsing into waste. The stench clung to him, making normal life impossible. He was shunned by others, even barred from churches and communal meals. His wife could no longer share his bed, and his sons were destined for the same life. The job never ended. In winter, waste froze solid. In summer, it festered faster, yet it had to be removed for the castle to function. Duncan's labor was essential, yet he was treated as less than human, forbidden from sacred spaces, denied burial. In consecrated ground and isolated in life, Duncan knew he would die unremembered. Still, he endured. The work gave him insight into the castle's hidden realities. He saw the remnants of noble diets, the evidence of illness. Occasionally, a child or young noble might treat him kindly, reminding him of shared humanity. As Duncan aged and slowed, he faced the prospect of being discarded. No retirement existed for laborers like him. When he could no longer work, he would be left to die quietly. His life, like those of many others, would never be recorded. Yet Duncan and those like him formed the unseen scaffolding of medieval society. Their suffering enabled the comfort of others. Their endurance, in the face of hardship, preserved a quiet kind of dignity. Though history forgot their names, their toil built castles, maintained cities, and kept the powerful clean and safe. The story of Duncan MacLeod is not just about degradation, it's about resilience. It reminds us that human value is not tied to status, and that dignity can survive even in the darkest places. As we reflect on their suffering, we're called to consider, what kind of world we build today, one that remembers the invisible and honors the labor that sustains us all. The Viking raids were not merely acts of chaos or opportunistic violence. They were deliberate, methodical campaigns designed to extract maximum wealth and leave behind a landscape unable to recover. These were not impulsive attacks by desperate marauders. They were the operations of a culture that had turned warfare into a strategic enterprise. When Viking forces approached a wealthy monastery, they did not simply storm the gates in a frenzy. First, they sealed off escape routes, ensuring that no one could flee, and warned neighboring regions. This wasn't just for efficiency, it was psychological warfare. Fear spread faster than fire, and the terror they cultivated often did more damage than their blades. Once resistance had been neutralized, the raiders moved with chilling efficiency, organizing, cataloging, and distributing wealth according to internal codes of rank and value. This level of organization reveals a truth more disturbing than the violence itself. Viking society had institutionalized these raids. They had tools built specifically for siege and looting, refined loading systems for their longships, and even established practices for managing captives. This was not mindless savagery. It was structured exploitation. The use of terror as a tool was perhaps their most enduring weapon. The Vikings knew that stories of their brutality traveled further than their sails. A single, strategically visible raid timed for maximum exposure, perhaps during a market day or a religious holiday, could paralyze entire coastlines. Survivors were often spared intentionally, tasked with spreading tales of horror. The psychological scars outlasted the raids themselves, altering patterns of trade, settlement, and even faith. Monasteries were more than treasure troves. They were hubs of learning, farming, medicine, and regional stability. When they fell, entire areas collapsed with them. Their destruction didn't just strip a village of silver. It erased libraries, disrupted food production, and silenced knowledge. The effects rippled across generations. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Viking economics was the slave trade. Unlike silver, which vanished once spent, human lives provided recurring profit. Viking settlements had infrastructure for this holding: pens, transport routes, and trading hubs designed for the capture and sale of people. Scholars now believe that across the Viking Age, hundreds of thousands were taken. Villages were emptied, family lines ended, and entire cultures reshaped by absence. Even Viking law reflects this grim reality. Their codes detailed slave classification by age, skill, and origin. There were procedures for control, sale, and disturbingly methods for stripping identity. This was not chaotic cruelty. It was a system, and its efficiency was devastating. Religious targets were chosen not just for their riches, but for the spiritual blow their loss would deliver. Altars were defiled, sacred texts burned, and holy days turned into scenes of horror. The goal was to destabilize, to make communities doubt not just their leaders, but the very beliefs that had once comforted them. These acts were not incidental. They were symbolic, psychological. Warfare dressed as blasphemy. What's most unnerving is that the same warriors who orchestrated these campaigns would return home to ordinary lives. They were farmers, merchants, fathers in their own communities. They held honor. This capacity for compartmentalization, kind of moral dualities, suggests a culture shaped not by randomness, but by deeply ingrained systems that rewarded selective ruthlessness. The long-term consequences were immense. Regions devastated by raids had to divert resources into defense rather than progress. Fortifications replaced farmland. Guard towers stood where schools could have been. This wasn't just looting, it was forced regression. It's the need to prepare for future raids, crippled economies, and stunted innovation. Generational trauma took root. The sound of waves on a quiet coast could spark panic. Children born years after the last raid still inherited fear from their parents' nightmares of smoke and steel, passed down like heirlooms. Some coastal towns vanished entirely, abandoned after repeated attacks, reclaimed by forest and sea. Others rebuilt inland, further from the threat, reshaping the very map of Europe. The political world changed too. Kings who once fought each other turned to uneasy alliances out of necessity. In defending against raids, they stumbled toward centralization. Larger armies, faster communication, stricter order. In a grim paradox, Viking chaos helped birth European states. In some places, the cultural scars ran so deep that the idea of the sea itself became linked to danger. Architecture shifted. Churches were built like fortresses. Coastal routes were abandoned, and folklore filled with warning. These were not just memories, they were survival lessons encoded into a continent's culture. The Vikings also targeted intangible symbols of cohesion, burning family records, eliminating artisans, and wiping away entire professions in one generation. The loss of storytellers, builders, healers, and scribes was a cultural wound that bled quietly for centuries. Without them, traditions faded. skills disappeared, identity blurred. Even regions the Vikings never reached directly felt the shock waves. Rumors of longships were enough to trigger walls to rise and treasuries to empty. Dire societies lived under the shadow of raids that might never come. That fear, ambient but powerful, shaped everything from tax policy to town planning. What emerges from this history is not a portrait of individual cruelty, but of a civilization that engineered its survival through the systematic disruption of others. The Vikings didn't stumble into greatness. They carved it methodically, ruthlessly, into the bones of those they conquered. Today, Viking legends often focus on ships, battles, and gods. But beneath that mythology lies a legacy of broken communities, vanished languages, and stolen lives. Their influence was real and enduring, but so was the cost. The echo of their longships still lingers, not in the waves, but in the altered course of history itself. Villages that had once welcomed travelers with warmth became wary and unwelcoming to outsiders. Trade networks that had thrived for generations disintegrated as merchants avoided routes that had turned into ambush zones for Viking raiders. Close-knit fabric of medieval society began to unravel as distrust spread among neighbors. Accusations flew blamed local rulers for their failure to defend them, while others suspected informants in their midst. Paranoia took hold, seeping into every corner like an invisible plague. The economic fallout was equally devastating and long-lasting. Monasteries, once vibrant centers of knowledge and commerce, were left in ashes, libraries burned, relics stolen, monks slain or scattered. These institutions had preserved ancient wisdom and served as schools for the elite. Their destruction left vast intellectual voids where learning faded and literacy declined. Farming collapsed as fields were left untended, animals stolen, and harvests abandoned due to fear or violence. A once thriving trade web connecting distant towns dissolved as merchants no longer dared to travel. Coastal communities bore the brunt of this economic breakdown. Generations of fishing villages lost their boats, their tools, and their skilled artisans as people fled inland for safety. Shipbuilding and navigation knowledge passed through family lines, vanished when entire households were wiped out. Once busy, ports fell silent, their markets empty, their docks decaying. The inland regions suffered too, as goods like fish and salt no longer flowed from the coasts. The demographic toll of the raids reshaped Europe's population map. Massive death tolls and fear-driven migration emptied entire areas. Fertile plains and river valleys, once heavily settled for their rich trade and farmland, stood abandoned. Survivors clustered around fortified sites, changing the face of medieval settlement patterns. This population shift deeply affected local politics. Rulers now presided over thinly populated, fragile domains. The Viking threat changed political structures as fear of invasion led communities to trade freedoms for security. The feudal system evolved partly from this chaos. People accepted new restrictions in return for armed protection. Kings and nobles drained resources from growth to fortification, weakening their ability to govern and thrive. Some even paid Viking chieftains to avoid attack, an act that encouraged further raids and undermined authority. The cultural and religious impacts cut deeply into the medieval soul. Holy sites once believed to be protected by divine will were attacked without mercy, shaking faith to its core. Clergy, once viewed as spiritual shields, were powerless as their prayers failed to halt the destruction. Some saw this as punishment for moral failings, leading to waves of self-punishment and spiritual panic. Others lost faith entirely, turning back to old beliefs or embracing grim philosophies shaped by violence. The loss of sacred relics was especially painful. Items believed to hold miracles were destroyed or looted, breaking emotional links to the divine. The ruins of churches, once vibrant centers of community life, now stood empty. Their bells silenced, their rituals disrupted, and their spiritual guidance lost. The rhythm of daily life, once structured by church calendars and services, was thrown into disarray. Women and children endured unique suffering in the aftermath of Viking incursions. Those captured often faced brutal lives in foreign lands, permanently cut off from loved ones. Children born from the union of captive women. And Viking men often lived in between worlds, belonging fully to neither culture. While some served as cultural bridges, their lives carried the weight of violence. The collapse of family structures caused widespread consequences. Orphans struggled to survive or were taken in by the few religious institutions that still functioned. Widows faced difficult paths in a society with limited options. Some were forced into arranged marriages for survival, others into poverty or desperation. With support systems crumbling, the social cost of the raids echoed for generations. Support systems for vulnerable members of society faded as communities fractured and scattered. Technological and military developments born from Viking aggression reshaped European warfare and defense. Sudden, swift raids demanded architectural innovations that prioritized rapid construction and strong fortifications over beauty or comfort. Watchtowers, signal fires, and fortified crossings became familiar sights across Europe. Military strategies evolved as well, emphasizing mobile cavalry and heavily armored infantry to counter Viking raids. These innovations later proved vital in major conflicts like the Crusades and the 100 Years' War. The linguistic and cultural effects of Viking incursions proved surprisingly enduring. In areas of permanent settlement, Scandinavian languages mixed with local speech, forming hybrid dialects still seen today. Place names in Britain, Ireland, and northern France reflect Norse roots. Cultural customs, from oral storytelling to burial rites, retained Viking influence for generations. Legal codes also absorbed elements of Norse law, including ideas of personal rights and restitution. Environmental impacts, often overlooked, were also significant. Farmland left unused led to new forests in some places, while elsewhere, soil quality declined from neglect. Damaged irrigation systems, altered water patterns, and disrupted wildlife habitats. With the collapse of coastal fishing, some marine ecosystems rebounded from overuse, while others declined due to the absence of traditional ecological practices. Abandoned livestock either perished or became wild, changing local environmental balances. Perhaps most profoundly, the Viking invasions reshaped European consciousness, ending what some scholars call a period of medieval innocence. Before the raids, many communities lived in isolation, their understanding of the world shaped mostly by local life and faith. The violent arrival of seafaring strangers forced a realization that the world beyond was unpredictable and dangerous. This awareness influenced future exploration, global trade, and military strategies. Europeans increasingly looked outward, not just for protection, but for understanding and engagement. Even concepts of courage and manhood shifted. The once revered image of the peaceful monk or chivalrous knight was challenged by the grim need for warriors who could face Viking brutality. This clash between spiritual ideals and harsh survival instincts led to cultural tensions that resonated across centuries. Art and literature from the post-trade era depicted heroes caught between devotion and vengeance, torn by inner conflict. Political and administrative reforms born from Viking threats helped shape centralized governance. The urgency of defense pushed formerly independent regions to organize under common leadership. Warning systems became more efficient and new methods of communication emerged. Record-keeping improved to monitor supplies and maintain links with scattered settlements. These systems laid the foundation for more structured medieval governments. The intellectual toll of Viking assaults left long shadows. Countless manuscripts containing ancient knowledge, scientific thought, and historical records vanished in monastery fires. Some were lost forever, others survived only through distant copies. Dispersed scholars could no longer pass their wisdom directly to students, disrupting generations of mentorship. The resulting literacy decline contributed to what is sometimes described as a dark age of European learning. The interconnected trade routes that had once linked distant parts of Europe were severely altered by Viking interference. Some were permanently closed due to constant threat, while others were redirected along safer but less efficient paths. Higher transportation and protection costs led to increased prices and fewer imported goods. This isolation forced communities to rely more on local production. Though this boosted domestic industries, It also reduced cultural interaction and technological sharing. Diplomatic changes sparked by Viking raids shaped inter-European relations for generations. Alliances and treaties made for defense led to new political alliances that long outlived the raids. Some rulers, recognizing shared danger, forged cooperation with former enemies. Others used the threat to justify seizing land or consolidating authority. Paying raiders for peace also set a precedent for future diplomatic strategies with external threats. Gender roles also shifted during this turbulent time. With many men lost in battle or occupied with defense, women assumed larger responsibilities in homes, trade, and communities. Though temporary, these expanded roles left a lasting mark. Even after conflict subsided, some women retained their authority, slowly broadening the societal roles available to them. The architectural influence of the Viking Age stretched well beyond defense. Churches rebuilt after destruction often featured fortified elements, blending sacred and defensive designs to reflect the changed reality of medieval life. Settlements began to favor defensible positions. Hilltops and islands gained popularity, marking a shift not just in strategy, but in medieval architectural sensibilities. Architectural priorities shifted toward speed and defensive function, producing simpler structures that contrasted sharply with earlier ornate designs. Psychologically, life under constant threat gave rise to new cultural norms centered on survival. Communities built intricate alarm systems, from fire signals to messenger networks, requiring vigilance and upkeep. Children learned to spot signs of oncoming danger and respond swiftly, so deeply taught they endured long after the Viking threat faded. Health consequences extended beyond battlefield wounds. The endless tension and trauma led to widespread psychological distress. Resembling what we now identify as PTSD, spiritual comfort merged with evolving therapies to address mental strain. Social disruption and chronic anxiety weakened physical health, increasing sickness and reducing lifespans. Education, once guided by monasteries, collapsed in many areas, slashing literacy and halting intellectual growth. Loss of learning impacted law, science, and culture, with knowledge often reduced to fragile oral traditions. Restoring education required immense time and resources, and pre-raid levels weren't reclaimed for centuries. Even after the raids ended, their shadow shaped Europe's development in subtle but powerful ways. The experience of seaborne attacks informed coastal defense strategies for centuries. Collective memory of the Viking terror etched itself into cultural perceptions of Scandinavians. Political and legal innovations made under threat became lasting pillars of European governance. The Viking era stands as a clear example of how external shocks can reshape civilizations. The Europe that rose from the Viking Age was a transformed one hardened by trauma, yet resilient in adaptation. Following the peak of Viking aggression, Europeans faced a broken world. The certainty of old ways was gone. Monasteries, once places of peace, now resembled strongholds, with high walls and iron gates. Surviving monks lived differently. Eyes always scanning the sea, routines split between scripture and sword drills. More than buildings changed, the psychology of Europe had shifted. Entire generations were raised under the shadow of Viking sails. Children grew up with fear embedded into daily life, learning to sleep lightly, hide valuables, and read the wind for signs of strangers. Communities developed advanced alert networks, fire signals, and horn calls that could reach across valleys. In moments, the very layout of medieval Europe reflected this tension. Towns rose on hilltops, and forests near coasts were cleared to expose invaders. Trade withered under these changes. Merchants avoided coastal routes, preferring slower inland paths. This added time and cost to commerce, shrinking once thriving networks into localized defensive economies. Fishing villages stayed near shore, pilgrims no longer arrived by sea, and coastal churches turned their altars away from the water toward land and safety. Faith, too, was shaken. The violent desecration of holy places forced believers to question divine justice. Some embraced militant religion, interpreting Viking raids as divine trials requiring violent resistance. Others turned inward, adopting mysticism to explain suffering. This religious transformation helped pave the way for later concepts like holy war. Militant interpretations of faith took root, giving theological backing to violence in the name of righteousness. This helped set the stage for events like the Crusades. Socially, the feudal order began to shift. The old reliance on agriculture and landed wealth was ineffective against mobile seaborne threats. Professional fighters replaced farmer levies. Communities began valuing leaders for their protection more than their lineage or land. This change elevated military roles. Influencing cultural ideals, martial honor and chivalry gained prestige, reshaping European values. Technologically, the Viking raids spurred major innovations. Ship design evolved quickly as Europeans studied Norse vessels and merged their features with local models. These new ships would one day carry explorers across oceans, turning maritime dominance in Europe's favor. Fortifications also transformed. Wooden fences and dirt walls were replaced by stone structures, even in small villages. These stronger defenses helped birth the medieval castle and shaped European architecture. For generations, culturally, the raids left deep marks. Oral histories were dominated by stories of survival, fear, and resistance. Folklore began to favor not noble knights, but ordinary people who showed courage in chaos. Themes of vigilance, loyalty, and the fragility of civilization became central to storytelling and art, even after centuries. These motifs echoed through literature and legend. Language itself bore the mark of Viking contact. Regions once raided or settled adopted Norse words, especially for seafaring, trade, and conflict. These linguistic blends still exist today and place names in common terms, a lasting sign of Norse presence. Perhaps the most enduring legacy was the reshaping of how Europeans saw themselves. Before the raids, many saw Europe as a unified Christian realm, but Viking incursions fractured that unity, replacing it with regional isolation and self-reliance. This fragmentation laid the groundwork for the rise of nationalism and long-standing political divisions. Demographically, many areas never fully recovered. Populations were decimated. Some towns vanished completely, others swelled with refugees. The balance of population shifted permanently, redrawing Europe's human geography. The psychological effects were deep and long-lasting. Survivors of raids often carried visible signs of trauma, sleeplessness, hypersensitivity, and relentless anxiety. These individual wounds became societal patterns. Communities remained wary, always anticipating danger. Women and children, frequent targets, suffered unique emotional scars. Mothers who had lost children lived with overwhelming grief, often becoming overprotective. Children who had endured violence grew into adults who struggled to form stable bonds. These cycles of trauma embedded themselves into family life and community structure. Economically, Europe adapted to a new world. Trade became cautious and localized, favoring familiar partners over open markets. This slowed economic growth and reduced cultural exchange. Where once there had been vibrant trade, now there was caution and control. A new class emerged, professional defenders. Their skill at reading threats made them valued leaders even after peace returned. This altered the nature of power. Those who could protect were elevated, even if they lacked noble blood. Religion, too, changed. Monasteries that had once focused on study now trained in survival. Learning gave way to preparation. Theology was sidelined for tactics. Resources once used to copy books were now used for reinforcing doors and training guards. This shift affected centuries of European intellectual life. Architecture followed suit. Churches were built like fortress-sized thick walls, narrow windows, high ground. Delicate carvings gave way to heavy stone. Beauty was sacrificed for strength. Reflecting a countenance turned toward defense, even law evolved. Post-trade legislation emphasized internal loyalty and harsh punishment for betrayal. Survival became a communal effort, and laws reflected a mindset shaped by fear, vigilance, and memory. On the loyalty and vigilance of every member. These legal innovations would influence European jurisprudence for centuries. contributing to legal traditions that emphasized community solidarity over individual rights. Reflecting on the transformation of European civilization in the wake of Viking brutality, we see a continent forced to reimagine itself. The confident, expansive Christian civilization of the early medieval period gave way to a more defensive, fragmented world where survival took precedence over cultural achievement. Yet this traumatic transformation also contained the seeds of future strength. The defensive innovations, military technologies, and social structures forged in the crucible of Viking raids would eventually contribute to Europe's ability to project power globally. The Viking terror was transformative, but not in the way the raiders may have intended. Rather than destroying European civilization, they compelled it to evolve to become harder, more adaptable, and ultimately more resilient. The Europe that emerged was more militarized, defensive, and fragmented, yet better suited to endure the violent uncertainties of its time. The medieval world was a tapestry woven from desperation and cruelty, where survival demanded extraordinary sacrifice. Through our exploration of Viking raids, peasant poverty, and feudal oppression, we witness both humanity's capacity for resilience and its tendency toward systematic brutality. Most disturbing was how suffering became normalized and accepted condition of existence. Peasants toiled not in hope, but resignation. Merchants paid for safety, knowing resistance meant death. Villagers watched harvests burn, understanding starvation was the lesser evil. This normalization created a psychological battlefield as treacherous as any physical one. Mothers loved children they knew might not survive. Fathers passed down trades likely to kill their sons young. Communities were bound not by prosperity but shared pain. Forming solidarity in hardship, brutality infected every level of society. Lords taxed the starving, fearing stronger rivals. Priests preached acceptance of pain as divine will. Viking raiders killed not just from bloodlust, but because honor demanded it.
Mercy became praiseworthy only because cruelty was the norm.
Orphan sheltering abbots were exceptional in a world where abandonment was standard. From craftsman to apprentice was a rare light in a sea of ignorance. This culture of suffering bred strength. People created art in ruin, sang songs of noble loss, and found meaning in agony. They showed a resilience modern comfort often obscures. The legacy of this brutality shaped our world. Ideas of justice, rights, and democracy emerged in opposition to medieval oppression. The belief that suffering isn't destiny was born from centuries of hardship. Understanding this past is not to glorify pain, but to honor the journey toward justice. Every freedom we enjoy was paid for by generations who endured, so we might dream of something better. The horrors of medieval life were not historical accidents, but the outcomes of systems built on power, imbalance, and ignorance. Civilization is not a fixed state. It is a choice, one that must be defended daily. The darkness of the medieval world warns us of what happens when brutality is accepted. It also shows the potential for transcendence when we choose courage over convenience, justice over indifference. Perhaps the most brutal truth is this: medieval society operated on the belief that most people were expendable, suffering inevitable, and power unaccountable. Breaking free from this required not just revolt but a radical reimagining of human worth. The scars of Viking terror run deeper than textbooks admit. By the 10th century, Viking raids had become more than pillaging. They were machinery of oppression. Norse raiders became kings, codifying the violence they once inflicted. In Normandy, England, and Sicily, former pirates became rulers, institutionalizing terror into law and governance. The transformation was total. Populations accepted brutality as natural. Children were raised to believe might made right. Monasteries became fortresses. Churches blessed weapons. Compassion was replaced with dominance. The raids hadn't just destroyed structures, they reshaped the medieval mind. This created the Viking paradox. Their violence worked so well. Future conquest was unnecessary. When people preemptively submit, collaborate, and internalize their oppressors' values, conquest is complete. Chroniclers grew numb to slaughter. Warrior cults glorified trauma. Legal codes protected the strong. Villages organized around violence. Monasteries sanctified war. The church rationalized what had nearly destroyed it. Demographically, regions emptied. Culturally, knowledge withered. Economically, trust vanished. Yet the greatest change was psychological. Europeans learned that only violence ensured survival. This lesson echoed through the Crusades, colonization, and industrial warfare. The Viking blueprint target culture, spread terror, destroy resistance, became the model for future atrocities. But their success also revealed human complicity. Lords allied with raiders, merchants sold slaves, priests justified submission. The raids revealed how icily morality fades under threat. Victims became perpetrators. Societies adopted the values of those who oppressed them. Collective Stockholm syndrome set in. People began to admire Viking ruthlessness, believing it was the only path to safety. This explains how brutalized societies committed their own atrocities. The Crusades, colonial, genocide, religious persecution. By the 11th century, Viking tactics had become European norms. Civilians were targets. Terror became a tool. Cultural destruction and enslavement were standard warfare. Even worse, these horrors were romanticized. The brutality that once caused trauma became heroic legend. Sagas praised conquerors, ignored victims, and turned torment into glory. This sanitized memory allowed medieval people to avoid facing their own transformation. The psychological cost continues today. The glorification of violence, the worship of dominance, and the normalization of cruelty are legacies of this age. Civilization today still bears these fingerprints. The question remains, how much of what we admire was built atop forgotten suffering? The Viking raids didn't end because morality triumphed. They ended because the violence was fully absorbed. The world no longer needed raiders. It had become what the raiders had taught it to be. This is the brutal truth. The Viking Age changed how humanity thinks. They conquered not just land, but imagination. Not just people, but morality. They replaced compassion with fear, honor with power, community with control. They taught Europe that to survive, one must dominate. And so, the Viking Age teaches us this. The greatest threat is not the enemy at the gate, but the enemy we become to protect ourselves. The deepest wounds are not physical, but those that damage our empathy and conscience. That is the final legacy of Viking brutality. Not gold, not conquest, but the reshaping of human identity, and perhaps the only true resistance to this. Darkness is the courage to choose mercy when cruelty seems easier. To remember the cost of forgetting our shared humanity,